We'll start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mir Weiner, the director of the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 26th annual Alexander Darling Lecture. The lecture was founded in 1998 in honor of Alexander Darling, professor of history and political science here, the founder of Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies at Stanford, and also the longtime director of our center. Alex was a rare example of a scholar who navigated smoothly between history, politics, and current events. He wrote several classics, most important, the still unsurpassed monograph on German rule in Russia, 1941-1944, and numerous books and articles on Soviet policy, diplomacy, and domestic reforms in the 1980s. All along, Alex played a major role in promoting Russian and East European studies in the country as a president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies and the chairman of the National Council for East European and Soviet Research, and promoting relations with scholars from former communist countries, establishing and running the program of democracy fellows here at Stanford, and played an instrumental role in the foundation of the European University in St. Petersburg. We're very happy today to have in our audience Alex's wife, Professor Gay Lepidus, and two of his close former colleagues, David Holloway, who succeeded him in the Spruance Chair for International History, and Norman Neymark in East European History. It is my honor to present today our distinguished speaker, Sir Lawrence Friedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at the University at the King's College London. Over the last 4 decades, Professor Friedman established himself as an eminent authority in strategic studies and also inspired the revival of interest in military history around the globe, especially in this country, but in also many other places. His numerous publications require me to put my glasses on. I will just cite a few of them: Strategy, a History, The Future of War, Ukraine and the Art of Strategy, The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy, and most recently, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, and the list goes on. And all I can say, I was educated on several of these books. Side by side with his academic activities, Professor Friedman also fulfilled governmental services. He was appointed and wrote the official history of the Falkland Campaign and served as a member in the official inquiry of Great Britain and the war in Iraq, 2003. Among his many awards, I would cite only two: a Fellow of the British Academy and Commander of the British Empire. Today, Professor Friedman will share with us his thoughts about the strategic features and prospects of the current war in Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Sir Lawrence Friedman.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to have been invited to deliver this lecture in memory of Alexander Darling as we approach the centenary of his birth and celebrate his enormous contribution to Russian studies. I've been reading him again, enjoying the combination of deep learning, vigorous analysis, and sharp writing that marks his work. In particular, I've looked at some of the essays gathered together in the volume, The Uses of History, edited by Gail Lapidus. These essays demonstrate his determination to maintain scholarly objectivity in a politically charged field while avoiding getting stuck in an ideological rut. These are qualities that are much needed today. The themes of those essays seem quite contemporary. The context is very different. We have the same questions about continuities in Russian history and the possibilities of change. Meanwhile, the challenges in maintaining a degree of objectivity as Russia fights an aggressive war are, if anything, even greater. Dallin saw the dangers of assuming the worst and taking a hard line on all matters Soviet. It could mean adopting what he called a vulgar demonology that denied actual or latent diversity, variety, change or choice. There had been periods, earlier periods, when observers of the Soviet Union succumbed to naivety and wishful thinking. And autocracy, repression and centralization were formidable continuities. He was nonetheless unsympathetic to those hawks who he believed abused history in order to argue that there was no point in engaging with the Soviet Union because its patterns of behaviour had been fixed, rigid, long ago. Of course, change did happen, and when it did, Dallin was one of the first to observe that the collapse of the Soviet Union had not been inevitable, but depended on a combination of underlying trends and poor choices. The challenge was to avoid assuming that Russian politics were destined to follow a particular course, and to recognise that along with factors that might seem to be embedded, one must always stay alive to the play of the contingent and the unforeseen. In an early paragraph in his essay on the uses and abuses of Russian history, he describes two distinctive positions, both of which he considered woefully wide of the mark. If there are some whose reading of the past leads them to conclude that the values and purposes of the Russians are and will remain incompatible with those of the civilized West, there are also others who find the key to Soviet behavior abroad in the fear engendered by memory of a millennium of invasions and incursions from abroad, making West Coast policy but a defensive response to this trauma. We can easily recognize the 2024 versions of these conclusions, except that now our thoughts are no longer dominated by the durability of a one-party system, but of a personalized dictatorship. In March 2014, Vladimir Putin embarked on a war against Ukraine, which has now lasted almost as long as did the war in Afghanistan, which eroded the legitimacy of the old Soviet system. This war reached a new level of destructiveness with the full-scale invasion of February 2022. Thus far, it has been used by Putin to tighten his hold over Russian politics, with his opponents either killed off, incarcerated, or hiding in exile. One-party states have in principle a governance structure that can restrain tendencies to dictatorship, even if they can't eliminate them altogether. But Putin didn't advance by navigating his way through party structures, but through taking patronage where he could find it, proving himself with administrative competence, and demonstrating a quiet ruthlessness. He was barely noticed as he rose, and then underestimated as he made his push for the presidency. He now shows no interest in sharing power and lacks an obvious successor, a sensible precaution for an autocrat, but obviously one that leaves, opens up possibilities when mortality takes its course. He's advised by a few like-minded courtiers with the state apparatus that he has fashioned and populated to suit his purposes. Instead of the optimistic project dictated by the precepts of Marxism-Leninism, or the modernization he promised in 2000, he's pursuing objectives that are both deeply reactionary and revanchist. He claims to be preserving the values of a civilization under threat and offering protection to those who embody those values, if only because they speak the language. As a result of all of this, we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to make sense of the belief system and calculations of this one man. Policy debates in the West revolve around what matters to Putin and why, and what, if anything, can be done to lead him to change his mind. This inevitably leads to questions about his sanity and risk-taking propensities. In a recent essay, I described Putin as a strategic fanatic. I didn't mean by this that he's crazy or even irrational. As has been demonstrated many times, he's able to speak at length on a range of topics. He doesn't rush into hard decisions and often puts the most difficult ones off until in the hope that they can be avoided. At times he's been pragmatic. He's always smartly turned out and has not taken to dressing up as a field marshal and pretending, as did Stalin, to be a natural generalissimo with his own unique and perspicacious theory of war. There is logic to what he does. Ends are related to means in a consistent fashion. But being rational is not the same as being sensible or reasonable. Dictionary definitions of a fanatic point to someone with extreme beliefs that lead him to behave in unreasonable ways, and that is what he does. The unreason in Putin's case stems from his fixation with Ukraine, or at least a caricature version of Ukraine, as an artificial construct with a divided society and an illegitimate government. Almost as soon as he began his second stint as president, his determination to bring Ukraine firmly into the Russian sphere of influence led to a series of calamitous errors of strategic judgment. When faced with the dire consequences of bad decisions, he doubled down in the conviction that even more extreme measures would give him the result he sought. To get a measure of the calamity from his perspective, compare the situation in the summer of 2013, when Ukraine had the most pro-Russian president it was ever likely to get, with the situation now. Putin is more than capable of a tactical lie. He can also be quite transparent. The starting point for any analysis should be to pay attention to what he says. This is obviously important when assessing the causes of the war. This is an issue that's been addressed many times, and I'm not going to dwell on it here. Against those who claim that aggression was a valid response to NATO expansion, we can point to Putin's long essay of July 2021, in which he gave, not for the first time, nor the last, as Tucker Carlson realized, his historical exegesis on why Russia and Ukraine should be considered as one. He ordered this invasion of Ukraine because he thought it should be subservient to Russia. The invasion went badly wrong, although with a bit more luck it could have succeeded, at least in the first instance, before the problems of occupying such a vast and hostile country would have become apparent. Putin's always been a risk-taker, prepared to use armed force to achieve his objectives. He pacified Chechnya, bloodied Georgia, annexed Crimea, messed with eastern Ukraine, and intervened in Syria. And in all of these, he would have assumed that his calculations had been correct, that he had achieved some success. He had deliberated about Ukraine in 2022 and presumably believed he had a workable plan. He just got it wrong. In his calculations, he will have been influenced less by the West's assertive promotion of Ukraine's strategic interests, but its hopes that all difficult situations could be contained and managed. There was a dry run with Georgia in 2008, when it became clear that Western interests were to calm conflicts down. As Defense Secretary Robert Gates noted at the time, quotes, "The United States spent 45 years working very hard to avoid a military confrontation with Russia. I see no reason to change that approach today." Even after Crimea, the consensus view in Europe was that its energy dependence on Russia, which was allowed to grow, limited its options. We miscalculated how much control of Ukraine mattered to Putin, and were therefore shocked when he gambled on being able to subjugate his neighbour in a matter of days. We miscalculated again when we assumed he would succeed quickly, and but then the invasion failed to achieve its immediate objectives. The campaign faced setbacks, leading to a massive loss of life and equipment, and a need to devote yet more resources to the war effort. Yet Putin has not buckled, and at the moment is confident that he has regained the initiative. The main reason for this is the painful congressional dance surrounding military assistance to Ukraine, which we must hope is about to be resolved. But we must also consider to what extent Ukraine's lack of vital capabilities, or at least the delay in getting to Ukraine, meant that it could do no more than it did when it had the initiative. I believe that was due to Western countries allowing themselves to be intimidated by what were considered to be Putin's extreme risk-taking propensities, including a readiness to contemplate nuclear escalation. So my argument in this lecture is that the West was influenced by a combination of this assumed recklessness of Putin's, shaped by a familiar strategic construct, the escalation ladder, that can be seriously misleading. In particular, I'll argue that it led policymakers to start with the most dreaded scenario, nuclear use, and then work backwards to ask how it might come about. A better approach would have been to start with the situation faced by Putin and consider the options available to him, of which nuclear use might be one, but was always going to be by far the least compelling. I'll start by unpacking the notion of an escalation ladder and explain where it came from. I'll then show how it was applied to the Russo-Ukrainian war before considering why the application led to some poor policy choices, particularly by the US. I'm not saying that the Americans or other allies have got everything wrong. They've got much right, or that nuclear risks can be ignored. My only point is that the way that they were assessed led to undue caution in the support given to Ukraine. Escalation as a term is used regularly in connection with any type of conflict to show how it might move to new and potentially more dangerous and violent levels, and then become much harder to contain and resolve. The term entered the strategic lexicon in the 1950s in connection with debates on how a nuclear war might be fought in a limited way. It was used to point out that this was an illusion. However restricted the opening salvos might be in their yield and target, the war would soon become total. The image of the escalator was employed to convey this tragedy. Once you stepped on the escalator, you're bound to go to the next level, even if you soon concluded you'd rather not. Once you step, the dynamics behind escalation would be provided either by a sort of tit-for-tat mentality that means that if one side ups the ante, the other must surely follow, or the sort of miscalculation or chance event common in war. The escalation metaphor was soon criticised for being too simplistic. It failed to recognise the potential for graduated moves. Escalators can go down as well as up. In between the ground and the top floor, there are intermediate stages where one can step off. In due course, the metaphor was not so much abandoned as subverted. Escalation was presented not so much as a tragedy, but a process that could be controlled. It was Herman Kahn who introduced the concept of the escalation ladder, which when you think about it is one of the great oxymorons of strategic thought. He argued that the challenge was to find a level of warfighting which left the enemy at a disadvantage, daring it to move to a new and even more dangerous level. This was called escalation dominance. These conceptual developments were heavily influenced by attempts to navigate the dilemmas of the nuclear age, and in particular, how to exploit nuclear threats to achieve political objectives while avoiding a suicidal all-out war. But this escalation ladder has had an unfortunate effect on strategic thinking. The problem lies in the idea that war progresses through a series of discrete, sequential steps, each one carrying more risk than the one before. So the war becomes more violent and gets out of control by degrees. The individual steps on the ladder can supposedly be distinguished one from the other, and potentially recognized by the enemy, so that the significance of each move, each passing threshold, would be appreciated. Each step up the ladder had a potentially political as well as military content. While trying to win whatever battles were being fought, a message was sent to the enemy about the extent to which restraint was still being shown and the consequential risks if these restraints were removed. It was a form of bargaining, a competition in risk-taking, which must not be allowed to get out of hand. It can't recognise that the adversary might have a different ladder in mind, with more or fewer steps, with thresholds viewed differently. If that was the case, then this was likely to be an imperfect form of communication. The intended significance of each move might be missed, as they would be appreciated through quite different conceptual lenses. More seriously, the metaphor bore little relation to the actual conduct of wars. They rarely unfold in a linear fashion, moving from one step to the next. Big engagements can come early in a war and then subside. Different types of battles of varying degrees of violence and intensity can occur at the same time in a range of locales. The idea of controlled escalation was influential in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, with attempts to manipulate North Vietnam's behaviour through the calibrated use of force, as if steady incremental pain could be added until the enemy's breaking point could be found, a form of coercive diplomacy described by another famous Stanford figure, Alexander George, as turn of the screw. The experience demonstrated the problems with the approach. Enemies could adjust to steady increases in pressure, while not always appreciating the political nuances supposedly conveyed in the various ways in which they were being bombed. I'll now turn to the current war and the influence of concerns about escalation on US policy. In May 2022, President Biden provided the most authoritative statement of the US position. Quote, "We do not seek a war between NATO and Russia. As much as I disagree with Mr. Putin and find his actions an outrage, the United States will not try to bring about his ouster in Moscow. So long as the United States or our allies are not attacked, we will not directly engage in this conflict, either by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine or by attacking Russian forces. We are not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia." He then added that there were no indications that Russia had any intention to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but he wanted to be clear, quotes again, "Any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict on any scale would be completely unacceptable to us, as well as the rest of the world, and would entail severe consequences." The statement had important implications. Most obviously, the US would not want to get involved in the war. As Russia began to attack civilian areas with missiles and bombs, Biden had already turned down President Zelensky's request for a no-fly zone, as this would involve direct combat between US and Russian forces. Yet it still took time before modern air defense systems were approved to help Ukraine out. Nor would Ukraine be supplied with notionally quote-unquote offensive systems because the US was not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. It must not take the fight to the Russians. These limits were set by presumed Russian red lines. The only American red line identified was that there could be direct engagement if Russia used nuclear weapons. In an interview with CBS, Biden was asked what he would say to Putin if he's considering using chemical or tactical nuclear weapons. Biden replied, don't. You will change the face of war unlike anything since World War II. When asked about consequences, he said, "You think I would tell you if I knew exactly what that it would be? Of course I'm not going to tell you. It'll be consequential. They'll become more of a pariah in the world than they've ever been. And depending on the extent of what they do, will determine what response will occur." Senior officials explained that the Russians had been warned of potential consequences, but these would not be made public. According to the New York Times, administration officials have said they could think of almost no circumstances in which a nuclear detonation by Russia would result in a nuclear response. Non-nuclear responses range from a conventional strike against a unit or base responsible to providing long-range systems to providing, as has happened eventually, long-range systems to Ukraine, or other forceful responses, as well as using Russia breaking the taboo to get neutral countries to adopt sanctions. The punishment would not necessarily fit the crime. There was an imbalance in the narrative. While even in response to such a terrible act, the implication was that the US would take care with its response. Much of the debate focused on how readily and wildly Russia might lash out if provoked. Great effort was put into identifying Russian red lines with the presumption that any might quickly lead to nuclear use as if there was no alternative. The most obvious trigger point, one that I believe did have to be taken seriously, was NATO fighting directly alongside Ukraine. But there were a number of others. The next most obvious was that Russia might be losing. Colin Carl, as Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, said, Ukraine's success on the battlefield could cause Russia to feel backed into a corner, and that is something we must remain mindful of. Graham Allison, taking time off from the Thucydides trap, argued that if it came to a choice between losing and using nuclear weapons, Putin would barely hesitate. Forced to choose between humiliating defeat on the one hand and escalating the level of destruction, there's every reason to believe he chooses the latter. Even if not losing completely, another trigger might come if it looked like Ukraine might be taking back Crimea. That's Kevin Ryan. If a Ukrainian offensive threatens the loss of Crimea or the provinces that form the land bridge to it, Putin would demand an escalation of the fighting to prevent that loss. Even with deadlock in the battlefield, Putin might be so frustrated that the weapons could coerce, that he would look to nuclear weapons to coerce Ukraine to surrender. Matthew Kronig warned that a Russian nuclear strike, quotes, could cause a humanitarian catastrophe, deal a crippling blow to the Ukrainian military, divide the Western alliance, and compel Kyiv to sue for peace. Lastly, Masha Gessen warned that Putin would use nuclear weapons almost because he could, as a matter of retribution. Quotes, the losses the Russian military is suffering now can only motivate Putin to create more terror against more people. It's important to highlight four features of these speculations, for that is all that they were. First, while contemplating escalation to the highest level of all-out nuclear war, they would largely arise as a result of Russia's military failure in its aggressive war and Ukraine's advantage to take advantage. Secondly, with any nuclear use, Ukraine would be the victim, and the most likely systems to be used would be short-range systems with relatively small yields, so-called tactical nuclear weapons, another strange term. Nuclear use would be pretty strategic. Thus, Nina Tannenwald worried if the war continues going badly for Russia, Putin might reach for a tactical nuclear weapon, a low-yield bomb designed for use on the battlefield out of frustration. Third feature of these scary scenarios, that they had important policy implications, whether in urging care when it came to humiliating Putin or in advice to Ukraine to cut a deal before matters got really nasty. And yet fourth, the speculation often depended more on a psychological analysis of Putin than any reference to what he had said or consideration of what options he actually had available in the event Russia faced serious difficulties, let alone how nuclear use would help in these circumstances. What's Putin actually said? His approach follows the June 2020 Russian Federation policy statement on nuclear deterrence, which reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of any weapon of mass destruction against it, but also, quote, aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. It doesn't refer to minor setbacks or anger at being shown a lack of respect. It accepts that the use of the nuclear arsenal would be a big deal. This is not just because of squeamishness on Putin, but because the nuclear arsenal is very important to the modern Russian state. It provides an affirmation of Russia's great power statement and a means of deterring American power. It is, to quote Putin, the key guarantee of Russia's military security and global stability. It's not something to be squandered on matters which are essentially secondary. And this is the spirit in which Putin has uttered his deterrent threats. They're not directed at Ukraine. I didn't actually think Ukraine had to be deterred when he started this war. But they're directed at the US and its allies, telling them not to enter the war directly on Ukraine's side. In 2014, at the time of Crimea, he remarked that other countries, quote, should understand that it's best not to mess with us, with a reminder that, quote, Russia is one of the leading nuclear powers, in case we've forgotten. On 24th of February 2022, as he announced the full-scale invasion, he said, no matter who tries to stand in our way, or all the more so create threats for our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. He's never deviated from this position. When announcing the annexation of 4 provinces and full mobilization on 21st of September 2022, he blamed the West for threatening a nuclear catastrophe. It was in response to the supposed NATO threat that he said, quote, I want to remind you that our country also has various means of destruction, and in some components more modern than NATO countries. And if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. It's not a bluff. The citizens of Russia can be sure that the territorial integrity of our motherland, our independence and freedom will be ensured. I emphasize again, with all the means at our disposal. On 14th of October 2022, after a period in which there had been intense speculation about Russia going nuclear, Putin was asked at a press conference about whether NATO would send troops into Ukraine if it faced defeat. He replied, sending troops into direct engagement and direct clash with the Russian army is a very dangerous step that could lead to a global catastrophe. I hope those who talk about this will be smart enough not to undertake such dangerous steps. He's therefore always directed his threats at the West and not Ukraine. While of course he may still fail in Ukraine, at no point has Russia been at risk of occupation or subjugation by Ukraine. There is therefore no existential threat to Russia. Now, as noted, the Allison quote, it's been argued that a loss might not be existential for Russia, but it would be for Putin. Of course, there are personal political risks to Putin with failure in Ukraine, although perhaps not as much as there would be to leaders in a democratic country. I believe it is the case that Putin would prefer to keep this war going rather than face the reckoning of admitting that he has failed in his quest to subjugate Ukraine or consolidate his hold over Ukrainian territory. But that's not the same as saying that he would take a decision with incalculable consequences because he can't think of anything better to do or felt personally threatened. Putin is not the only senior Russian opining on this matter. Figures such as Peskov and Lavrov have stayed very close to Putin's stated position when asked. The exception in official circles is former President Dmitry Medvedev, Deputy Chairman of Russia's Security Council, who regularly raises the spectre of a nuclear apocalypse. if Western countries act against Russian interests, thus following an American observation that it would be legitimate for Ukraine to attack Russian targets in Crimea. Medvedev warned that if Crimea was attacked, quote, "Judgment Day will come very fast and hard. It will be very difficult to hide." After the announcement in 2023 that Ukraine would be receiving F-16 aircraft, he described a scenario of, quote, "loss for everyone, a collapse, apocalypse, where you forget for centuries about your former life until the rubble ceases to emit radiation." Referring to US deliveries of Abrams tanks, he foresaw direct conflict with NATO, which had turned into an openly fascist bloc like Hitler's Axis, albeit larger. We are ready, although the results will be achieved at a much greater cost to humanity than in 1945, and so on. The tone and regularity of Medvedev's comments, the lack of follow-through, and regular rumours about his sobriety have led to these threats being taken less seriously than he might have wished. There are numerous statements, sometimes quite wild by media propagandists, but also disturbing proposals made by more established commentators, such as Dmitry Trenin and Sergei Karaganov. In particular, an article by Karaganov in September 2022 attracted a lot of attention. He argued that Russia had both thoughtlessly set too high a threshold for the use of nuclear weapons and also inaccurately assessed the situation in Ukraine. Actually, I thought his comments on why things have gone wrong in Ukraine and the problems of Russia meeting its objectives were one of the most interesting things about what's in general a rather bizarre article. After 75 years of relative peace, he argued, people, especially in the West, had, quote, "forgotten the horrors of war and even stopped fearing nuclear weapons. Somehow, the West must be persuaded to retreat or even surrender. Roughly speaking," he said, "it must buzz off." This required lowering the nuclear threshold, quote, "by rapidly but prudently moving up the deterrence escalation ladder," the terminology that reached him. Even getting to the point where we'll have to urge our compatriots and all people of goodwill to leave their places of residence near facilities that may become targets for strikes in countries that provide direct support to the puppet regime in Kyiv. His assumption was that the only way to get a supine government in Kyiv was to scare its supporters away. It's important to note that within Russia these arguments were challenged. The critics noted that nuclear use would not solve the issues between Russia and the West, would aggravate Russia's international position and create a risk of all-out nuclear exchanges. They warned against underestimating the West's readiness to climb the escalation ladder and overestimating the possibility of China and others tolerating a strike. Most importantly, when at the October 2023 Valdai conference, Karaganov put his thesis directly to Putin responded that he understood the sentiment, but then reaffirmed established doctrine. Quotes, "nuclear weapons would be used as a retaliatory strike in the event of the first US strike, if possible from when an incoming attack was first detected, no first use, and the second from when something would threaten Russian statehood and the existence of the Russian state." Same line. In June 2023, he also rejected the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons. First, he said, we see no need to use it, and second, considering this, even as a possibility, factors into lowering the threshold for the use of such weapons. The existential threat to the Russian state has not arisen and is unlikely to arise. There was one point in the war when it looked like Russia might really be losing. In September 2022, when Ukraine mounted successful offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. The Russian campaign was in serious trouble, and Putin was facing pressure from ultranationalists about the incompetence with which military operations had been conducted and the enormous loss of manpower and equipment. This was the point when US intelligence reportedly picked up chatter about tactical nuclear weapons amongst responsible Russian commanders, although it never moved beyond chatter. This led to the Biden administration making strenuous efforts to get in touch with their Russian counterparts to warn them not to do anything foolish. CIA Director William Burns was deputed to meet with FSB Director Sergei Narishkin to warn of the dangers associated with nuclear use. The odd thing about this meeting, as Burns describes it, is that Narishkin was expecting some sort of peace proposal and was surprised by the nuclear concerns, which he dismissed. More helpfully, at Washington's instigation, German Chancellor Scholz used the opportunity of a visit to Beijing to persuade President Xi to pronounce against any nuclear use. Later, Xi's joint statement with Putin, 21st of March 2023, restated the standard formula, quote, "There can be no winners in a nuclear war and it must never be unleashed." But none of this meant that Putin lacked options in September 2022 to help him get out of the predicament he faced. He escalated, but in ways relevant to the state of the war. He raised the stakes, setting the objective of annexing the 4 additional oblasts and ordering mobilization. The immediate focus of the Russian efforts shifted from taking land to hitting Ukraine's critical infrastructure. So even in a corner, he didn't need to resort to nuclear use. The Biden administration has shown itself to be particularly worried about the impact on Moscow calculations of an attack on Russian territory, even if they were this would be far from constituting an existential threat, as opposed to just an irritation and embarrassment. These concerns meant that the US held back on providing Ukraine with long-range systems, even though Russia was acting with impunity against Ukrainian territory. Here's a good example of how blurry these lines can be. Moscow insists that Crimea is part of the Russian Federation. And since September 2022, that also goes for Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, although none have ever been fully occupied. Yet there was no way Washington could tell Kyiv to avoid Russian targets in these territories, Ukrainian territory. Yet for Russia in principle, these were Russian territory. So there's the red line. Although Ukrainian threat to liberate Crimea was one of the speculative scenarios which might lead to nuclear use, what's happened instead is not a push to liberate, but random and occasional Ukrainian attacks, first using their own equipment, later British and French missiles on military targets in Crimea. Cumulative effect of these, especially on the port of Sevastopol, has been substantial. The attack on the Kerch Bridge, linking Crimea to mainland Russia, made Putin visibly angry. But these happened incrementally. It didn't seem like crossing a big red line at the time. More seriously, Ukraine has developed their own long-range systems capable of attacking Russian territory independently of relying on Allied systems. This has been done with increasing regularity, including drone attacks on Moscow. There's also been attacks by Ukrainian-sponsored Russian oppositional groups into the border territory of Belgorod, from which many attacks on Ukraine have been launched. And however embarrassing Russia finds these, actually, if anything, there's a tendency in Russia to play them down, because they don't want to suggest that such attacks really hurt. These attacks have become more serious for Russia with a more sustained Ukrainian campaign against oil facilities. This has led to American complaints, partly because of the effect on oil prices. I would have thought events in the Middle East had slightly more of an effect, but also as bad strategic choices. The argument is that Russia can recover from these, and they provide an excuse for the much more devastating attacks on Ukrainian energy systems, as if the Russians needed an excuse. It would be better on this argument to concentrate on liberating territory from Russia, although this may seem a bit rich, given the lack of serious American material support for the last 6 months that has left the Ukrainians engaged more in desperate defences than bold offensives. At any rate, a riskier nuclear escalation has not been mentioned in an argument about this action, and even if there is a debate to be had about this specific set of targets, the right to attack facilities inside Russia is no longer seen to be fraught with existential risk. It remains the case that Western countries don't want to be implicated in attacks on Russia and on recognized Russian soil. And Ukraine has made explicit promises when it has acquired systems such as the UK Storm Shadow, air-launched missiles and US attackers that make promises that they won't be used in this way. Nonetheless, the general trend was for the Biden administration, to quote the Washington Post, to become less worried about Russian red lines because Putin, quote, has not followed through on promises to punish the West for providing weapons to Ukraine. As each system was delivered, usually after long delays and deliberations, there was no particular response other than those the Russians would have taken anyway to protect their military position. As this was recognized by NATO countries, the more relaxed they became about giving the Ukrainians what they asked for. But the steps were incremental, not great leaps up the escalation ladder. The most serious problem with the nuclear speculation is the lack of explanation of what strategic value the Russians might get from resorting to these weapons. Let's consider some of the operational issues. How exactly would the Russian military go about the first use of nuclear explosions since 1945? Would they want surprise? Given what we know about US intelligence capabilities, these might pick up evidence of weapons being moved out of storage and into position, or communications between relevant units. These preparations might be broadcast by the US as they did prior to the invasion. Would the Russians deny this? What would the Chinese say? What, for matter, would the Russian people think if they thought the country was on the brink of a nuclear war? Might there be a flight from major cities? Supposing they achieved surprise, would they want to make a coercive point with a demonstration shot, warning what might come next if Ukraine does not comply with its demands? But this would still raise all of the issues that arise with preparations for an attack in the first place, if they were revealed. Or what would happen with deliberate prior warnings in terms of international reactions against what is to come. They would have to cope with the reaction from anxious friends. These are systems that have not been tested for a long time. Have they been well maintained? What would be the impact if delivery systems were intercepted or the warheads turned out to be duds? This is a relevant consideration with regard to a demonstration shot, as well as one intended to make a military difference. Any doubts on reliability might argue for a larger attack, in which case, depending on the number of ground bursts, this could lead to fallout. Where might that drift? Would Ukrainian formations in the field or civilian facilities and areas be the main targets? If the former, formations in the field, are there places where there are no, are these going to be in places where there are no other better military options available? In the role of glide bombs being used recently, and no Russian troops in close proximity to the Ukrainian targets. If the latter, would the aim be decapitation of the Ukrainian leadership? But after that, Russia would still be left with the problem of what to do with Ukraine, and there would be nobody with whom a surrender could be organized. Would this make any subsequent occupation any easier? I open this lecture with Alexander Dallin's warnings about allowing an image of the Soviet Union to be shaped by prior policy preferences or concerns about appearing complacent. And I'm not arguing in this lecture for sanguinity about either nuclear risks or, for that matter, Vladimir Putin's mental state. I am arguing against allowing our analysis of one of the most difficult and fateful conflicts we have seen in Europe for almost 80 years to be overly influenced by our worst fears and simplistic theories about how they might be realized. Hard strategic assessment of the state of the war may lead to awkward conclusions. We have not helped ourselves, let alone Ukraine, by opting for an approach which has resulted in demands that Ukraine accept a bad peace and caution in providing it with the weapons it needs to achieve a better peace. Thank you.
forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Friedman. How do you think the war in Ukraine will affect Putin's calculation in the Middle East?
In the Middle East. I think at first he thought it was a good thing because it distracted the United States. I think he was clearly pretty uncomfortable about the Iranian attack because Iran is sort of an ally of the of Russia now, and it sort of puts him as part of an axis of Iran, North Korea, maybe China. It's not wholly comfortable company. If you think back, what Putin had done with the intervention in Syria has made himself a player in Middle Eastern politics. And I think what's striking, actually, about the last 6 months, other than votes of the UN, is how little Russia is playing a role in Gaza and in the current Israel-Iran spat. So I think it reflects, the limited bandwidth they have as well. And this is slightly unrelated, but I was very struck with the last, about a year ago now, the Putin-Xi meeting, when you read the communique, just how much it had been dictated by the Chinese. You just get the sense that there's only so much capacity in Moscow at the moment, and it's all used up on the wall, and very difficult to deal with other issues.
Good evening. My name is Vinay. I am a foreign policy researcher from India. I'm touring this place, so I turned up here. It's fashionable amongst research circles to talk about the mental state of world leaders, their psychological well-being, what has gone into their upbringing, etc. Do you think with the Ukraine war, President Putin has finally reached a saturation point? Personally, as a person, psychologically, he has reached a saturation point with the Ukraine war. And if he has reached such saturation point, what impact will that have on the rest of his tenure that God has in store for him as President of Russia? Thank you.
Well, God's quite important in this, because Putin makes regular references to how he's doing God's work, or at least the Archbishop of the Orthodox Church, whose manifesto is worth reading just to remind ourselves of the ideological well springs which are about as far removed from Marxism-Leninism as one can imagine, with some striking homophobia included. I'm not sure Putin has reached a saturation point. If you watch him at conferences and speaking, I think there's a lot of wishful thinking about Putin, that he was really ill, that he was at the end of his tether. As I said, I think he believes in what he's doing, and he's advised by people who believe it too. He doesn't surf the internet, he doesn't browse, so he presumably believes what he's told. He defers to Shoigu and Gerasimov. I don't get any sense that after September 2022, which I think was a genuine turning point, and then possibly when he became confident that the Ukrainian counter-offensive was not going to achieve what people hoped it was going to achieve, I think he's more confident than he was before. He talks more about the war now than he did in its early stages. So I don't think he has reached a saturation point. I think if the bill goes through Congress, which I hope it does, then that will be quite an important new stage in the war. At the Valdai conference, he was sort of, I think he was there, he was talking about how Ukraine depended on baubles from the West, and these were now being withdrawn. if they suddenly come back. And the Europeans, which I hope people notice, are actually doing really quite a lot at the moment to try. They can't fill all the gaps left by the US, but they're doing what they can. So the combination of that and the Americans coming back in earnest, I think will make a big difference. And so you may see some reaction to that. But my working assumption is what you see is what you get, too much psychological profiling of Putin may well lead you to, I think, misleading conclusions. He's been reasonably consistent throughout. He hasn't veered all over the place. He's just, labouring under a massive misapprehension about Ukraine. But that's been there since, on some accounts, since the start of his rule.
The Financial Times has reported that not only did the United States make threats of direct involvement if Russia used nuclear weapons, but that the UK and France did as well. Can you comment on whether you think that's accurate, that reporting is accurate? And more generally, what's the view from people in London about how this is going? And do they have some of the domestic issues that we have dividing us on responding to Ukraine?
The UK debate is there isn't a debate in the UK. The governing party and the opposition party agree. And the feeling is that the UK, has done the right thing. It was to the fore in the support of Ukraine and sort of been the first mover on a number of issues, not the most important mover, but the first one on tanks, on long-range missiles, on defensive systems before the invasion. So there's pretty steadfast support in the UK. I think people would get quite scared if they thought we were going to get more directly involved. There's sort of a lurking debate. A number of British figures, military leaders, have said, we need to prepare for war. This is where it'll go, and so on. So that debate is going on. But I think the view in London, one of my colleagues has been advising now, he's on his third Prime Minister, but it's been pretty consistent. If we fail in Ukraine, this will be the biggest crisis that we've ever, far bigger than the Ukraine thing itself. NATO will be engaged in a much more serious way. And for that reason, you need to do what it takes. So I think, it certainly is the case, as far as my understanding. One of the things that was said is that you can't expect us to stay disengaged if you've done that. But I think that's gone with quite a lot of vagueness about how it would actually work out. I don't think it's not spelled out in detail. But that's true. About my lecture, the whole way we talk about these things. Right. As soon as you try to talk about it in specific detail, it either becomes very scary or fanciful or whatever. So it's a general threat. But by and large, the British, French, and Americans have been as well. Now, of course, the French, who have been laggards in terms of, compared, say, with the Germans, in terms of how much material support, have been to the fore in suggesting, I think it looked like Ukraine was going to get beat, then there are circumstances in which Western forces might need to be employed. The Germans were pretty alarmed by that suggestion. Scholz jumped on it straight away, but Macron keeps on repeating it. I don't have any problems with saying it's something that might have to be considered, because you don't know. You just don't know how these things will work out. it is the case that if the deal doesn't go through this week, and probably the last chance, I guess, for it to do so, then, as Zelensky said, Ukraine could be defeated. And that would be an enormous shock to all Western policy making, and who knows what would happen. The striking thing is that, with the odd exception, Hungary, for example, European countries have been quite solid. Despite all talk of Ukraine fatigue, actually they kept at it. And at the moment, I think we're quite nervous about a situation in which they have to cope with this without the US.
Thank you very much for this very sharp and very precise evaluation of the Ukrainian war situation. I wonder, what is your opinion of the tensions within the Russian war camp? Possibly Putin has unleashed some powers which he can't even control, when we think of the Prigozhin episode, for example, and also the imprisonment of Girkin, Strelkov, and other people who are sort of doing the same thing as what he wants to do.
I think that was more of an issue in late 2022, and then came to a head. I mean, basically what was happening, of course it's happened again, is the Russian offensive. We tend to talk about failed Ukrainian offensives. We don't talk quite so much about the failed Russian offensives, which have been far bloodier and costly than anything that the Ukrainians tried last summer. And what happened was having hit upon a strategy that made some sort of sense in late 2022, build up fortifications so that we can attack Ukraine's infrastructure, which almost December 22 came close to succeeding. Putin got impatient and urged the offensive to be revived, and it was just what we've seen again recently, hordes of troops being thrown against prepared Ukrainian positions. The only difference now is that the Ukrainians are a bit more outgunned, but they're a bit outgunned then. And that created tensions. So there was a Russo-Ukrainian Prigozhin axis against Shoigu and Gerasimov. And basically, Shoigu did a clever ploy against Prigozhin, which undermined Wagner's business model, essentially, what this was about. And Prigozhin sort of took a part in order to restore his business model, and rather failed spectacularly. But the extraordinary thing was that he actually had the nerve to carry on going on that Saturday. What would have happened, because there wasn't a vast amount between him and Moscow, but he was persuaded, one wonders how, that if he just backed down, everything would be all right. Whether he, at that moment on an aeroplane where he realised that wasn't quite this, Britain doesn't keep those sort of promises, I don't know. And Surovikin, obviously, who was most accomplished general, as far as one can see, in the senior levels, has been pushed to one side. And there have been other cases of people complaining and so on. But by and large, we should never underestimate the sort of stoicism of Russian soldiers or the professionalism of the Russian military and so on. They keep at it. So I think, I've heard it said, and I would say that, it's a relief for Ukraine that Gerasimov is still in charge, because he's such an unimaginative general. Because if you'd had somebody with more skill with those assets, they might have made more progress. There's been, people talk about a lot of Russian adaptation, innovation and so on in their war effort, but not in the operational tactics they use.
Thank you for the lecture, and I'm about to ask a completely unfair question, which is about the end game, which you broached yourself when you talked about if the appropriations are not passed. You know, it's likely that, I think you said it was likely that the Ukrainians would lose the war. Of course, they say they're going to fight to the bitter end. So I wonder if you could explore a little bit with us how you see the end game. In other words, if these appropriations are not passed, what would be the end game in that case? And if the appropriations are passed, would the Ukrainians win the war, or would we continue along the same path we are on now? That is to say, a kind of stalemate back and forth. I mean, how do you see the war playing out?
Yeah. I mean, clearly Ukraine is in a lot of difficulty at the moment because the attacks on energy infrastructure, in which the first missiles are knocked out and then you just run out of air defense missiles. I mean, that indicates some of the difficulties. So whatever happens on Saturday, whenever it's going to be debated, the delays have already cost, and it'll take some time to recover. But if they, I think it would still be difficult for the Russians to make some of the progress people are talking about. They've lost so much mobility and equipment, so many experienced officers and so on. I don't think their combat power is quite enough. And the Ukrainians will fight, as we expect them to fight in February 2024 if the Russians have taken it. That's why I assumed as soon as the Ukrainians started fighting, Putin can't win. Still basically my view, that he can't win. But he can take a lot more ground and get to the point where he can say, we've got enough, we'll call a ceasefire now. And that will put Zelensky under a lot of pressure. But he, until he's got Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Donetsk and Luhansk tied up, I don't think that's going to happen. But who knows? So let's assume, the better news. So what we've learned is that the defence really is the same form of warfare in Ukraine for both sides. So we're in a sort of deadlock, and it does depend on supply and production and so on. Russia is spending 6-7% of GDP on the war. European countries' defence expenditures barely 2%, a bit more in some cases. America obviously much more, but really, if Europeans and Americans put an effort in, the size of their economies and their productive capacity is far greater. But they were too slow in building up productive capacity. That's starting now. It's moving along, not as fast as we'd like, but moving along. So I think there's a general assumption by the end of the year, Ukraine should be in a better position. And Russia will reach a peak. My view, I think my view has always been the war ends with a decision in Moscow. I can't see how it ends with a decision in Kyiv, because I just don't think the sentiment is there to cut a deal after all that's happened, despite this article that's just appeared in Foreign Affairs about the deal that might have been in March, April 2022, which when you look at it, is all about neutrality and nothing about the territorial endgame, about what would be agreed, which was going to be left to a conversation between Zelensky and Putin, so you could have imagined how that happened, especially after Putin. So I don't think it's going to happen because of the Ukraine decision. I think it will happen because Russia actually finds the whole thing futile. In the end, Ukraine's fighting for its existence, Russia is. So it's a sense of futility, of cost, of frustration, the sort of things that ate away over Afghanistan as well. There's nothing scientific about this. You can't be sure or what mechanisms there would be. But the Russian economy has got some serious issues. Anybody can have a booming economy if you put everything into war production. It's not particularly fruitful investments, and it creates labour shortages and inflation and high interest rates, which is where they are at the moment. So I think there's a danger in underestimating the Russians and their staying power and capacity, but there's also a danger in overestimating them and assuming that because there's an autocracy, they can, going back to the problem, the Prigozhin mutiny, just because you can't see what's going on doesn't mean to say there aren't things bubbling away. But you can't predict it. So that's why you need to think long term. To be honest, I thought both that this war would end before this because it's a strain on both countries. But nobody likes to lose. And there's an important distinction between not winning and losing. It's not the same thing. So if you may not be winning, but if you're not losing, you can carry on. That, I suspect will happen until there's a point where you can't actually see a way out. And I think that has to come in Moscow.
Okay, thanks very much for the lecture. I have maybe too broad a question, but it's the question is basically, what is this doing to European security? Obviously, it depends partly on the outcome of the war, but the US hesitation about providing support and the controversy over, indeed providing or passing this current bill, that surely has implications then for European security at a time when Russia looks to be on, in an expansionist mode.
So, there's more debate on this issue than there has been for a long time. It's partly Ukraine, it's partly Trump, and he tells us stories about telling European leaders that he's not going to support them against Russia unless they pay their whack. He seems to believe pay their whack to the United States, to him. And that, so that has led to a lot of. The difficulty is there's no real alternative to NATO. However you play it, there's no alternative to NATO. And I don't think the Europeans are in a mood. The EU doesn't work, partly because the UK isn't part of it anymore. The EU doesn't work. The EU's had a better war than many would have anticipated. But that's more on the managing the economic side of it. Done some military cooperation, but it's quite a painful process. So anyway, Britain's not a part of it. And Britain has been doing quite a lot on this issue and working with European countries. So I think the view is that NATO has to keep going, and I think one of the factors weighing on people is the anniversary celebrations that are coming up. 55 years of NATO are going to look a bit sad if the backdrop is Russians storming forward on the ground. So, until last year, it was in a good war for NATO. Finland and Sweden are really very big additions that bother the Russians. And the Finns are really up to it. If you talk to the Finns, this is they still remember the Winter War. I think they know how to fight it again. So I think in that sense, NATO has held together, but there's this big question about what happens if. So they have to make it work. And there's a lot of discussion going on. Obviously, nobody's going to. I mean, these are private discussions. So, occasionally they'll surface in the public domain. But by and large, what do we do if he comes back again? Which is an economic issue as much as a security issue, dominates a lot of thinking in Europe, as indeed it does here. So there is a big debate. It's not, and I think the issue is more salient than it's been for a long time. People are more tolerant of defence expenditure, more ready to accept things because they see the issue.
Thanks for the lecture, Eric Johnson. I was a student at Alex Dollins in the mid-'80s, and so I'm glad to be able to be here, see, remembering him still. I was wondering if you could say anything more specific to Crimea and tying together both the escalation ladder questions about what's happened so far, but also your view looking forward for what might maybe change the view of Moscow, change the view of Russians, both psychologically or on the ground. What do you think is behind the Kerch Bridge is still standing, and what might be potential for change? Is this still a capabilities question? Is it a fear of causing escalation, and then if something will happen there versus abilities to also both interdict that supply line there and then across the rail line that's going across the south?
I mean, I think Crimea is very important equation. The Russians, it's clearly frustrating to Putin. I mean, the fact that Sevastopol is barely usable as a port, the fact that Ukraine, without a navy, has managed to take out 20% of the Black Sea fleet is not insignificant. And some of the boats that it's been taking out are those that would be relevant to keeping Crimea the forces supplied if the Kerch Bridge went down. So I think there's a linkage there that's relevant. And some have suggested that the Ukrainians are going to keep on banging away at that until the point where the loss of the Kerch Bridge really makes a difference. It's not easy. I mean, they've had 2 goes in it. You can do it damage, but it would be a big deal indeed if it was knocked out. Yeah, but there's other ways.
The question of capabilities too is there a Western escalation fear also that you think?
I think that's well, the possibly is, but it's less than it was because Ukraine has attacked so many targets in Crimea now, and the Russians haven't been that sure about what to do about it. I mean, Putin justified the attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, or one big attack on Kyiv at least. I think I'm going to get my historian, I believe, strongly in chronology, I'm going to get it right. I think it was October 22, because of the first attack on the Kerch Bridge. So it is a big deal. But there's other ways that you can undermine and weaken Crimea, water supplies, all sorts of stuff. It is still quite dependent, and not as easy a place to live or go for your holidays as it once was. So I think Crimea is important, and I think if there was a serious risk to Crimea, I don't think it would necessarily be a cause for escalation, but it might be a cause for thinking maybe this is a time to call it a day because we don't want to lose Crimea. And that's obviously, with any peace talks, that's going to be one of the basic issues of contention. I think peace talks, by the way, are very difficult. Go back to the end game issue. There's just too many issues now of reparations and sanctions and so on. I think a ceasefire is much more likely. But a ceasefire means that you stop where the forces are.
If I may conclude with one question. If you were to advise Biden to do the one thing that he has not done so far, what would it be in the war in Ukraine? If you you want to add Sunak to this, fine, but
Well, Sunak's
that's easier.
Well, Sunak done what he can. Attackers, which is part of Johnson's surprisingly good bill. Do that and persuade the Germans to take time to give tours. I think you improve things and worry the Russians. But it's the basic thing the Ukrainians need at the moment: air defences, munitions, the basics that are really in short supply. And that creates a virtuous cycle. They're in a vicious cycle. One of their problems is manpower. Well, if you're a youngster being called up and you're being told that when you get to the front you'll have no ammunition, it's not a big incentive. If you're encouraged to believe that you will be supported, then their mobilisation itself becomes easier. These things are it.
With this, we conclude. Thank you so much.